What's up, everyone? Welcome to the RotoPros pre-lock show for Friday night. We had 15 games on the schedule. We're down to 14 now with the Nationals-Dodgers game getting postponed. And I'm not sure if there are any other games where we're going to see a rain out. We have rain issues in St. Louis, Chicago for the White Sox game, Atlanta again, and Cincinnati for the Cubs-Reds game. But I think all games should end up playing outside of the one that's already canceled. The Reds game is the riskiest, I think, of the remaining games, and it's not a spot I like all that much anyway. The Braves game, it looks like the rain should be towards the end of the night. So that game is definitely tricky, and I'm not totally sure what to do with that one right now. For the St. Louis against Philly game, I think we are going to be fine there. The rain should stop kind of earlier in the night, and maybe the game starts late, but I think we'll be completely fine after that. There shouldn't be any rain after the fact. But for those of you that have access to the RotoPro Slack chat or just want to message us on Twitter, definitely check in for weather updates as we get closer to lock, because this isn't set in stone and weather's unpredictable, but we're not even at 7 o'clock yet, so more could definitely change. As for the picks for tonight, starting with pitching, most of the pitchers that I like don't have really any weather concerns. So we've got Jacob deGrom on Draftkings. It's just the pricing on him is just ridiculous. I guess the algorithm kind of knocked him for his strange one-inning start that he made on Sunday where he didn't give up any runs. Looking more into it, it really looks like the Mets just were protecting him because he threw 45 pitches in the first inning, and they didn't want to risk him maybe getting hurt by throwing more pitches after such a high-stress inning. But the Mets are saying that there's nothing wrong with him right now. He had the elbow injury that caused him to leave his start before that early, but he's totally healthy, and it was just a precaution. So I have no issue with deGrom in terms of injury. And even if there was some risk, it's worth taking at that price tag. Like $9,800 for Jacob deGrom is just so far below his baseline, and he has a really, really favorable matchup against the Diamondbacks. The Diamondbacks have been awful offensively this year, although they do get Jake Lamb back tonight, but A.J. Pollock is hurt, so that's definitely a net positive for deGrom. Lamb's a good hitter, but Pollock has been the Diamondbacks' best player this season. Steven Souza recently came back off the DL. That's a knock too, but still the absence of Pollock outweighs all of that. And Paul Goldschmidt has just been awful this year. So even if he does a little bit better going forward, I mean, it's still a bad lineup overall. Peralta, Souza, Lamb, and then I guess Goldschmidt are good hitters. And then after that, it's Descalso, Kettle Marte, Alex Avila, who's been terrible, Jarrod Dyson, and a pitcher spot. It's a pretty weak lineup that deGrom's facing, and it's going to be kind of cold tonight, wind blowing in from right field, just a perfect pitcher's environment at Citi Field. So I think all-in deGrom is actually the play tonight. He's by far the best pitching value, and the options are a little bit thin, especially with Scherzer now not on the slate with that game being rained out. So I actually do think it's worth taking the risk and being all in on deGrom. Usually I'm more in favor of diversifying, spreading it around a little bit more. Usually my highest owned pitcher will be 80 to 90%, but I think 100% deGrom, even with some risk here, it's just so much value that if it doesn't work out, just play tomorrow, because this is the best way to play the slate tonight, is playing Jacob deGrom, at least at lower stakes, because in very high stakes tournaments tonight, I think deGrom could be well over 50% owned, maybe lower stakes. It is 14 games on the slate, so it should be pretty spread out, but I think sharper players will be on deGrom. So if there's anywhere to fade him, it's definitely at the more expensive contests where he will be much chalkier. But I think the best strategy to deal with this is just play a lot of lineups at lower stakes, kind of the same as always, and use deGrom in all of them, because there's just so much pricing value on him that it's certainly not worth ignoring. So with deGrom in every lineup, we don't need too many other pitchers. I think there may be 3 to 5 other guys that are worth looking at. And I don't really feel great about any of them, but there are a bunch that are okay. So I'm going to start with Charlie Morton, actually. He's priced up to $12,200. He has a pretty tough matchup against the Indians, but he is at home, and he's just been insanely good this year. So for some cheaper stacks, I actually think Morton is fine. He has an 11.47K per 9 rate this year, ridiculously high, and it comes with a swinging strike percentage of 13.8%. He's actually throwing harder than last year when he was already good. 343 FIP, 273 xFIP. He has a 203 ERA. He's basically been just about perfect this year. So I think you could include him where he fits. Like, I'm not going out of my way to use him, but I wouldn't fade him either. Like, if he happens to be a pitcher that fits into that end of your lineup, then so be it. I think Morton is fine to use, maybe just like 20-25% or so. And then there are some cheaper guys that are probably more viable than Morton. Nick Tropiano, I think, is my favorite one in this tier of the cheaper pitchers to plug in. He's 6,800. I think he's probably just an average pitcher with some strikeout upside, and he's facing the Rays at home. Good pitching environment in LA, at least when it's kind of cool outside and it's about 60 degrees tonight. The Rays offense is bad. They strike out a lot. It's a good matchup for Tropiano, and he's cheap. So I think he is probably the best of the cheap pitching options. And then we have Ivan Nova, who we didn't talk too much about on the podcast last night because we were concerned about weather in Pittsburgh. But the weather actually looks really favorable. It shouldn't rain at all until after the game. And the wind is blowing in very heavily from left center field. So it's a big boost to pitchers. We've seen the over-under for the game drop, I think, almost entirely because of this, from 8 down to 7.5, despite the public betting the over a little bit. So sharps around the under for probably just for the wind. And Nova is just really cheap facing the Padres, who strike out the most in baseball against righties. They're just a bad offense overall. The one concern for Nova, like, I think he'd be arguably a lock play tonight if it was kind of a normal Padres lineup, because Nova's an average pitcher priced down pretty far in a very favorable hitting environment for pitchers and an easy matchup. But the Padres are running out a lineup with 7 left-handed batters tonight. 6 lefties and a switch hitter, so 7 guys from the left side of the plate. Most of them are not good hitters, but Nova, he's a normal pitcher with regular splits who has been worse against lefties. It would be better if some more righties were in there. So it is a bit of a knock on him. And with all of that accounted for, I think he's just a decent play, nothing special. I think Tropiano is marginally better to use, but Nova is certainly worth having also. So those 2 pitchers for cheap, I think, are worth having. And then the other guy I definitely like for cheap is Michael Wacha, although I actually do like him less than what I had said last night. And sharp money for this game looks to be really, really heavily on the over. It's one of the only games tonight where we have that, where most of the bets are on the under, and the line is still jumped up half a run from 7.5 to 8. Kind of looking for a reason here. I think there's a good chance we have a very strong hitters umpire. I forget who it is, but I guess it doesn't really matter. Yeah, David Rackley, do with that information what you will. It doesn't matter what the umpire's name is, but we do care if he's going to have a smaller strike zone, and he is one of the stronger hitters umpires in baseball. So I don't usually look at the umpire information. It's usually just kind of negligible. Most umpires have similar strike zones. But when we see a sharp line movement in a game with an otherwise good pitching matchup, there is some reason to kind of look more deeply and figure out what it is that's actually causing this line movement. And I think the umpire is part of it. I also think Jake Arrieta is just really overrated. And even though he has this propensity for getting ground balls and generating weak contact, he's still just an overrated pitcher. So the majority of the sharp money here, I think, is for the Cardinals offense, but I think there's still a little bit here for the Phillies offense. So that kind of scares me off Wacha a little. And he is more expensive than Nova and Tropiano. So even with him being a better pitcher and facing the strikeout-prone Phillies, I think Wacha just kind of falls back into the same category for me as Nova and Tropiano, where I'd kind of use them all evenly compared to last night, where I kind of thought Wacha was clearly the best play of the group. Now I think he's just kind of in the pack with those other guys. And then the one other pitcher I think is worth using, and it's kind of just the same reason for DeGrom, is Zach Godley is facing the Mets. He gets the same boost from the cold weather, the wind blowing in. The Mets lineup doesn't have Yoenis Cespedes, so it's not a great lineup. Godley is more expensive, though, And he's definitely been worse this year overall than last year. His velocity was down a lot, actually, in his last start. For the year, he's striking out over 8 batters per 9 innings, but his swinging strike rate is down from, it was 13+% last year. Now he's in the 10s. I think Godley is probably just going to be kind of decent going forward. And the Mets offense should be better against righties going forward. But with the weather issues at Citi Field tonight, I actually think it's enough of a boost to use Godley also. So if I had to kind of say where I think those 5 pitchers would land in terms of ownership percentage, I kind of think 20% of each of them makes sense. If I had a lean, I think it's Tropiano. I think he is the second best after DeGrom, but I'm comfortable with just kind of mixing those 5 pitchers in 1/5 of lineups each around Jacob DeGrom, who I think is a pretty easy all-in play on DraftKings. So I'm going to check the weather again quickly, and then we'll move to offense. Let's see. All right. Got Atlanta, St. Louis. Okay. All right. So there's definitely risk in Cincinnati. I think there's risk in Atlanta. I think there's risk in St. Louis. The rain in Chicago looks fairly light, but I think that game is avoidable because the wind is blowing in pretty strongly and it's cold. Like, it's just not good conditions for offense tonight in Chicago for the White Sox-Rangers game. So even with Matt Moore pitching and even with Carson Fulmer pitching, the weather might be bad enough that you could just kind of overlook this game. And there are 14 games tonight, so no reason to go totally out of your way and use 2 terrible offenses on a night where there are better offenses in better spots. So even against bad pitchers, I'm kind of okay with fading the White Sox-Rangers game, partly for weather concerns and partly just because the weather that is there, it's not good for hitters. So favorite spots tonight, I think the game that we initially looked at yesterday was the A's-Blue Jays game, and I still feel pretty strongly about that, despite the fact that there's some pretty serious sharp money on the under. But the sharp money on the under looks to be entirely player news related. So Matt Chapman is out for the A's, and Teoscar Hernandez is out for the Blue Jays. So the offense has just gotten worse on both sides. Because of that, I definitely have a lot less interest in stacking the Blue Jays. Josh Donaldson as a plug doesn't really change too much. I don't think that he's too affected by who else is in the lineup around him. But with Curtis Granderson leading off against the lefty, that definitely hurts the lineup overall. Kendrys Morales is out. They're playing both Russell Martin and Luke Maile. So they have 2 catchers in there. It's kind of just a worse lineup tonight than usual. And for the A's without Chapman, it's a little bit worse. So I think the Blue Jays are worth targeting pretty heavily as plugs. I think Solarte's a good play. I think Donaldson's a good play. I think Russell Martin's a good play, a catcher. But I don't really want to stack them anymore without Hernandez in there. For the A's, though, I think 1 through 5 still makes a lot of sense. And I think even the bottom of the order, there are some decent hitters in there. Mark Canha has been good this year. Dustin Fowler steals bases. Chad Pinder's a little expensive. I'd rather use him against a lefty. But Josh Fegley for a punt, $2,400 for catcher. If you need the savings, he's okay. But I'm kind of just moderately interested now in stacking the A's. And for the Blue Jays, I think they're a very good source for plugs, but I don't really like them as a stack anymore without Hernandez in the lineup. So the next spot that we had talked about yesterday, just to make sure to cover all the bases, the Orioles against the Red Sox. So I didn't mention Pomeranz as a pitcher consideration, even though there's really sharp money on the under in the game because of the weather. It's kind of cold, wind blowing in from right field. The reason for that is that Pomeranz has just been basically awful this year with a swinging strike percentage around 7%. His velocity is way down. He's managed to get over a strikeout per inning, but I don't think it's sustainable given how few swings and misses he's getting, how few pitches he's throwing in the strike zone, and he's giving up plenty of contact. So I think Pomeranz is going to be pretty bad for the foreseeable future unless his velocity miraculously comes back. He could be pitching hurt, but he was throwing slower at the end of last year too. So maybe, I don't know, maybe he's just not as good as people initially thought he was. And his velocity had been much higher in the past when he was a reliever. So as a starter, he just may not be that effective of a pitcher. The Orioles would be in a great spot tonight against him if not for these kind of moderate weather concerns. Nothing in terms of the game getting postponed, but Just not great hitting environment tonight at Fenway. But I still like the Orioles because of how bad Pomeranz has been. They're a very high variance offense where they either strike out a ton or they hit a bunch of home runs. And they have a lot of right-handed bats at the top of their lineup. So I think there is potential for them to do really well against Pomeranz. Manny Machado is worth plugging, I think, all over the place. And I think Trey Mancini is too. And then for stacks, I'm fine with Jones and Scope and Trumbo. Not so much Chris Davis against a lefty, but I think Danny Valencia is a good play at third. So the Orioles aren't totally cheap, but I think they will be sufficiently contrarian where it's still worth using them. Because I think Pomeranz will be popular tonight, and there could be leverage on the Orioles because of that, but they should just not be very highly owned. So the Orioles are my favorite contrarian offense. The A's are my favorite offense for just overall expected output. I think I'm off the Red Sox now outside of plugs because of the weather there. Like I mentioned with the Orioles, it's the same game. The Red Sox definitely have concerns with the same weather as we wait for these fire trucks to pass outside. I don't know what's going on. Hopefully it's not here. So other offenses, the Orioles I think are a good play. The A's are a good play. I think Blue Jays for plugs. I think Red Sox for plugs are still fine where they fit. My favorite offense tonight might actually now be the Minnesota Twins. And we didn't mention them at all yesterday, just kind of didn't see them. But Brent Suter is really bad, I think. His numbers look okay, but he's done a lot of it out of the bullpen. And he's actually been worse against lefties every year of his career. So he's been reverse splits. And the Twins actually are also better at hitting against lefties this year. They're about an average offense against lefties, but they've been well below average against righties, despite the fact that they have a lot of left-handed hitters. Eddie Rosario and Max Kepler actually hit lefties pretty well. They have Brian Dozier in there, Eduardo Escobar. Joe Mauer hits lefties fine. He kind of just draws a bunch of walks and hits singles against any pitcher. I think Robbie Grossman and Byron Buxton are worth using. It's just a really cheap Twins offense outside of Rosario, who I think is good enough to pay up for anyway. But I think this stack could go pretty overlooked. Hopefully the Twins can get out to a lead where Josh Hader doesn't end up pitching, because that's always the concern with stacking against the Brewers, is that the Brewers will be winning late in the game and then Josh Hader comes in and then your offense basically is dead. But if the Twins have the lead, we shouldn't see Hader. Maybe it's possible he could pitch in a game where he's down a run. But if the Twins are doing well, we almost definitely will not see them face Josh Hader out of the Brewers bullpen tonight. So I think the Twins actually are the strongest stack spot. No weather concerns there, although I think we may be looking at some light rain towards the end of the game, but nothing really to be worried about. So it's a good spot for the Twins, and they're cheap enough. I think no one's going to use them. They might be as contrarian as the Orioles, so I like that spot a lot. And I think they're slightly more in play than the A's and the Orioles, who I also like. And, okay, there's one more offense, actually maybe two more offenses I want to touch on. I'm just going to do another quick weather update, and then we'll get out of here. Weather is very difficult this week. It's been quite a mess. Okay, so I mentioned, I'll come back to the weather game in just a second. Yeah, that thanks, Logan. That's what I'm saving for, because maybe we'll get a few more weather updates before I have to talk about that game in Atlanta. So I'm going to mention one more game first that I like a decent amount. So the Cardinals are seeing that sharp money towards the over against Jake Arrieta, and Arrieta is very walk prone. And if it's going to be a pitching umpire or just a hitting umpire, I guess, that doesn't call a lot of strikes, then the Cardinals could find themselves on the bases just a lot tonight. So my concern here is that Arrieta doesn't give up a lot of hard contact. Maybe there aren't too many extra base hits against him. But Tommy Pham can walk and steal bases. I guess he's a really good plug, I think. I think he's worth using across the board. And then the rest of the Cardinals are just so cheap. And I think they've just been really unlucky this year. Like Matt Carpenter, Jose Martinez, and Marcelo Ozuna are just better hitters than what they've been so far. And they're all priced way down for this matchup. So I think Cardinals stacks are worth having. I'm going to say they're less viable than the A's, Orioles, and Twins, who are my three favorite. But I think that they're right in the next category. I think they're a better stack, actually, than the Blue Jays now without Teoscar Hernandez. I think I'd rather use them than the Red Sox, who are just really expensive. I didn't even mention the Yankees, but it's a big park downgrade for the Yankees going into Kansas City, so I don't really like them too much either. But I think the Cardinals are usable for their cheap prices and probably make the most sense in a lineup that has, I guess, DeGrom and Morton in it where you need to save the salary. But Tommy Pham is someone I like a lot tonight regardless. So that's it for the Cardinals. And yeah, okay, this Braves game. So I guess I'll just talk about it because we're not going to get any more news. If the Braves game plays, they are definitely in a very strong spot. The only real issue here is their pricing. It is really, really high now. Albies and Freeman are 55 and 5,400. So that's actually the most I think that either of them has cost outside of maybe Freeman at Coors Field. But Dan Straley has just been a disaster in his 3 starts. Having said that, he was much better in his most recent start, which also was against the Braves, where he went 5 innings, gave up 2 earned runs, 5 Ks, 3 walks. Maybe he figured a little something out in that game compared to his disastrous first 2 appearances. But yeah, I'm not betting on Straley being good. I think he's probably average at best, and the Braves' offense is really good. But considering the weather concerns, I think you can avoid it. It's a lot to pay for a lot of these guys. And I think Ronald Acuna at 4,300 is the only real value source. Like 4,700 for Inciarte is kind of insane. 44 for Markakis, 54 for Freeman, 55 for Albies. I mean, they could score a bunch of points and still just, it's not enough to make them viable because it's too hard to fit them in. So I would have liked Tyler Flowers and Acuna as plugs, but because of the weather concerns, I think I'm probably just off this game unless we get a much more positive update before lock. And I'm trying not to be biased after the Braves game screwed me over yesterday. I really do think that this is a difficult spot for them. Difficult enough, at least compared to their prices, where they're just so expensive that it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to use them. Like, I think it's very similar to the Cubs, where the game probably plays, but even in a good matchup, it's just not really worth paying that much for some of these hitters. And I would use them as plugs if not for the weather concerns. Probably should have taken my own advice on that retroactively for yesterday, not played Chris Bryant and Wilson Contreras so much. But yeah, that's where I stand on the Braves. I think if we get a better weather update where we're more sure the game will play, then I think I'm okay with some Braves stacks and maybe just Acuna and Flowers as plugs. But for now, kind of just not really looking at it much. I'm going to scan quickly for plugs from other games. And yeah, the issue with looking at rain for Atlanta is that lightning is going to be a problem. I think that's part of why the game got delayed for so long yesterday. Like, the rain wasn't heavy at parts during the delay, but there was lightning in the area, so they still had to wait. And I think we have the same issue tonight. So it's a whole mess. Just given the prices, I think it's worth avoiding. But for plugs from other games, I think it's kind of just plugs from the teams I've already mentioned. Like, I think Tommy Pham is someone to pay up for. I think some Twins guys are worth using for cheap, like Grossman, Kepler, Dozier, where he fits. I think it's good value at second base. Who else do we have? See, the A's guys are all pretty cheap outside of Jed Lowry. I think Chris Davis is a really good play again tonight. He's just a really good power hitter. There's so much upside for him. If the weather improves a little in Texas, I think you could use some of the lefties because the wind is blowing in from left, so fly balls to right field may not be affected too much. But Mazara is a little pricey. I guess I'd be on board with some Gallo exposure, but I think we'd need a better weather update first. All right. So I'm not ignoring Mookie Betts and JD Martinez, but just only if they fit. I'm certainly not going out of my way to use them. Kind of the same for Mike Trout, too. I think you could pay up for him. I don't hate him against Blake Snell, but yeah, not going out of my way to use him in a pretty tough matchup. Snell's a decent pitcher. I think Buster Posey makes some sense at catcher against Kyle Freeland, and then maybe Gorkis Hernandez or Austin Jackson if one of them leads off for a cheap outfielder at the top of the order. And then the Tigers are probably a decent source for plugs, too. Nick Castellanos is 4,000 against Felix Hernandez, who's been awful this year. I think Victor Martinez is cheap enough to use. The rest of the Tigers are just bad, though, so I don't have too much interest in them. But barring any more questions, I think that's probably going to do it. Stay tuned for weather updates. Good luck not getting any rainouts in your lineups tonight. And I don't know if I'll have a show. I don't think I'll have one tomorrow, but I think Sunday morning I'll be back, and then next week too. So good luck tonight, and see you all then.